Is the government taking a balanced approach to the fight against radicalization and terror? This is step one. There'll be more steps. Will civil liberties and the right to privacy be compromised in a rush to secure public institutions? Let's get reaction from the foyer of the House. Aaron O'Toole is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade. He's here. Jack Harris is the NDP defence critic. And Wayne Easter is the Liberal public safety critic. Gents, good to have you on the program. Let me start with the opposition first, and we'll get your reaction first, and then we'll go to the government. We'll also have Stephen Blaney, the Minister, on. Let me start with you, Jack Harris. What do you make of the changes the government is proposing to give, for example, anonymity to intelligence sources and allow CSIS to take actions outside of Canada, as Rosie was saying, share information with our quote-unquote Five Eyes allies?
Well, obviously, this is not new, as you pointed out. It's not in reaction to what happened last week. This was in the can, as it were, some time ago, so it's no real surprise that these ideas are put forth. Obviously, the technical aspects of it are going to have to be looked at very closely. It does impact on judicial powers and authorities, and I think, you know, there's some sort of artificial distinction in some respect between what you can do inside and outside the country, particularly for CSIS in terms of an investigation. So, you know, there may certainly need some tweaking. We'll be having a very close look at that, obviously. We'll hear from experts on that and look technically at the aspects of the law. In terms of anonymity, you know, that again has to be balanced against, you don't want to be encouraging people to use the anonymity for nefarious purposes. We do have, you know, laws, for example, dealing with criminal gangs and this sort of thing, where people do have protection if they do come forward. So we have to look at that as well to see how far it goes, what the consequences are for investigations and for judicial oversight. Right. So we'll have to, you know, it's one of these things you have to look at very closely. Okay, so you're examining it, Mr. Easter. As we all said, there had been concerns that the government might change this legislation before it put it out in the wake of the attack. The government hasn't. This is what they had planned to do all along. What's your view on this? Any concerns?
Well, it's questionable whether they haven't or not. They intended to table this last Thursday and left it till today, so have some new measures been added in? I'm not entirely sure. On the first blush of the bill, we do need to look at it further. What surprises me is there's no amendments to the criminal code. Because I've been questioning for weeks now why the government on terrorist activity, both homegrown and people who come back from terrorist activity away, why they haven't been enforcing the current laws that are already in place in two areas. One, under the Combating Terrorism Act, and two, in this bill, they're strengthening some the ability under the Citizenship Acts on seizing passports. The broader powers, something like Jack is saying, then the broader powers, there's very broad powers in this bill for what CSIS can do in foreign countries. We didn't look at that very, very closely. And the bottom line, definitely there has to be a balance between national security interests and the interests of individual rights and freedoms. Well,
and the question is, does this bill strike the right balance? Let me go to Aaron O'Toole. This is the same legislation the government planned to table last week before the two attacks on soldiers in Quebec and Ottawa. And I guess we know about that. The real question for the government is, building on this, what further changes will be coming maybe to prevent those kind of attacks? Will there be changes to the criminal code? For example, preventative arrest thresholds. In other words, if you knew about couture rouleau, could under new legislation, would the RCMP be able to arrest him?
Well, what's interesting, Evan, is before our caucus meeting last week, many members of the press gallery, including Josh Wingrove, who were caught in the lockdown of the events last week, were questioning MPs on their way in on this very bill. And was it coming? Was it enough? These are powers that CSIS have said they need to make sure that they can properly keep tabs on people that present a risk. And I think if you look at this and where it's coming from, you see that we're trying to strike the right balance between public safety and minimally intruding on civil liberties. It's an important balance to strike. But from the Toronto 18 plot, you saw that was uncovered by frontline law enforcement, not just RCMP and CSIS, in part due to informants and in part due to people. In fact, many of the programs had one of those informants on the programs last week in the coverage. The Via Rail plot's another one. Law enforcement are learning from all of these instances, Evan, because homegrown terrorism and radicalization is is a recent phenomenon in the last decade or so.
But, you know, on that, just a question on that. You know, there's been a controversy about keeping the anonymity of sources because there have been questions in some cases. Even the judge might not be able to question an anonymous source, and that, you know, there is a security issue, but there's also a justice issue. The people who have been arrested, do they have the right to question the people who are sources? Where are you on that?
Well, what's great about our system, Evan, is the evidentiary burden can be challenged in court, and in some cases it's the source that, of where the evidence came from that can be protected. In many cases, to protect the lives of those informants and to encourage people to come forward with such information. But with our judicial system, we have a process where all evidence is challenged, both on where its origins are and how strong it is. So, you know, Canadians can rest assured that we're striking the right balance, putting public safety first and foremost. But our system is robust and can make sure that people are protected.
It's not a new idea, though, with the need for sources, whether it be you know, mafia-related criminal gangs that sources come forward, their lives are potentially at risk, and we have ways of dealing with that. So we have to look and see whether this legislation is necessary, is the right kind of legislation, does have sufficient judicial protection for individuals, etc., etc. So that's something that, you know, we're looking at now. Now that we've seen the detail of the legislation, we'll clearly be doing that, because, you know, you can talk about balance, but, you know, civil liberties is a very important value of our system, as well as obviously security.
But one of
hang on, just because of time there. Hang on, I want to get to resources real quick.
Resources is an issue.
The RCMP Commissioner Bob Paulson spoke about the resources needs for the RCMP. He said the RCMP are reallocating resources to cover all the radicalized or self-radicalized people, 93 individuals. Let me just show the audience what Commissioner Bob Paulson had to say. Check this out.
In recent months and over the past week, over 300 additional resources were transferred in to enhance the capacity of insets from other federal policing priority areas, such as organized crime and financial crime.
Okay, so one, he's clearly saying other priority areas have now lost RCMP officers. Two, Mr. O'Toole, the RCMP budget's been cut by 15% over the last 3 years. Will the RCMP be given more money now, not only to track this new threat, but to patch up the areas that they've just stolen from, to rob Peter to pay Paul?
Well, Evan, if you look at when we formed government to today, CSIS and RCMP are generally about a third, being funded by a third more, but their priorities shift. And if this is an area where the Commissioner and the force and frontline forces around the country, speaking to the provincial governments and federal government, we should look to make sure that they have the resources they need. And it's good to see them responding to what's happened the last week.
Why the cut to 15%? Was that costly? Will you relook at that, the 15% cut to RCMP?
Well, the pre-budget submissions right now from all departments and from, you know, MPs and from stakeholder groups are taking place right now. I think this is an important time to make sure do law enforcement have not just the legal tools, so parts of the bill that we've put before the House today, but do they have the resources to have it? Over time, Evan, we have increased funding to both CSIS and RCMP as our federal police force. Yeah. If we need to allocate specific funds, we should.
Let me go Wayne Easter and then Jack Harris. Hang on, because I just want to get Mr. Easter in there and then Jack Harris. Go ahead.
If there's one thing that has become evident about this government, they're all talk about the tools they add, and they're all talk about the resources they add, and usually they've added very little of either. And one of the problems that we're dealing with in this issue today, we're stacking legislation on top of legislation, or the government is, without having it being tested in the courts. That's why I've been so argumentative on the Combating Terrorism Act. Why hasn't there been charges laid so we know how it'll stack up in court? The same on the preventive detention. Why we don't have a court opinion there. And the other thing I want to come back to is, even with CSIS, Rosie said that they're going to do a better job of communication with the Five Eyes. Well, CERC come down on Friday and said there's real problems with communication for CSIS within Canada between regions and headquarters. That's a problem.
Okay, last word, Mr. Harris.
Well, of course, a couple of weeks ago, we had the Deputy Director of CSIS. I mean, you know, RCMP is talking about reallocating resources. The CSIS has said to a parliamentary committee that they don't have enough resources to actually follow the people that they know about. So that's clearly a problem. And as Wayne just pointed out, CERC said last Friday that they've got to pull up their socks on even communication with each other within the region so they know what's going on. So there's a few things that have to be fixed before we start, all kinds of rhetoric about new tools and all of that. We'll certainly look at anything that's brought forward, but let's make sure that the forces that we've got, both the CSIS, the RCMP, regional police forces, city police forces, they were the ones that uncovered the Toronto 18 after all in the beginning. So there's a whole group of people working on this that need to coordinate better.
All right, I got to leave it there. There's lots to come, lots of questions about security on Parliament Hill. We'll get to those later as well. And more legislation coming. Aaron O'Toole, Jack Harris, Wayne Easter. I'm in Toronto today. I miss you guys there in Ottawa, but thanks for being here.
All right, take care.
Take care.